It is Sunday, March 2nd, and it's getting pretty late with Jake Landau. Today, we have a new guest who is anonymous. Yes, we don't know their name, and I'm not going to tell you their name because I don't know their name either. But they are famous, at least in Ontario politics and soon-to-be Canadian politics, for memes. Yes, this is the Stephen Del Duca fan account, who, by their own admission, has not received a cease and desist yet, and who bears the jester's privilege, and oh boy, do I like a court jester. So we'll get into it and let them speak for themselves. Mr. Anonymous, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on here, good sir.
It's great. No, yeah, it's great to have you. I've been a fan of your work for a long time. I think you have a much better grasp of TikTok, to be frank, and Gen Z social media than any of the three political parties in Ontario. I mean, obviously the Conservatives won, but it doesn't feel like that was one of the reasons they won. It just feels like the other parties were worse. So I figure before we get into your work, how do you feel about the state of social media aptitude among the Ontario political parties?
I gotta say it is quite lacking. Let me just say first and foremost, absolutely perfect introduction for myself. I will give you bonus points for that. But it's very interesting to see because I feel like there is a 50-50 between people are doing it pretty well. Like I look at the Ontario NDP and I see their TikTok account and I think, all right, these guys got it going on. And then I see the Ontario Liberal Party who verified their TikTok account and hasn't made a single post.
I think you have several times the followers on your TikTok account that the official Ontario Liberal Party does, which is it's great for you, but that's not very good for them, is it?
Yeah, it's strange because I know people over at TikTok and they told me that the Ontario Liberals have verified their account, but they just haven't made a single post as of so far. So that's why I'm doing a 5-to-1 ratio on them follower-wise. I've given them the tips, but they just aren't taking them.
And how do you feel about the Greens and the Tories, the winners of this contest?
I gotta say the Greens are starting to really pick things up. There was a TikTok that I saw of Mike Schreiner doing a doing a layup on Doug Ford on the basketball court. Whoever made that, chef's kiss, compliments to him. But the PCs are just completely AWOL. I don't know what they're doing with their account.
Maybe it's just because the TikTok audience may not particularly be the demographic that the Conservatives appeal to. But then again, there is a larger youth contingent supporting conservatism than you would expect these days.
It is quite surprising just because if you look at the United States, they were looking to ban TikTok entirely. But with Donald Trump coming in as the new president and him exploiting TikTok and going on a lot of podcasts, you see this big resurgence in young men of becoming more right wing, and then you see these popular figures like Theo Vaughn who bring Donald Trump on their podcast, and Donald Trump using TikTok getting, I think it was something like 100 million views on his first TikTok. It's definitely ripe for the taking, so it's interesting to see them.
It is interesting that you bring up how the United States Congress initially passed a ban on TikTok, because in many ways that wasn't really because of privacy concerns as much as it was openly admitted to be a concern about TikTok's influence on public opinion regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. Not to get into the details of that conflict too much, but it is interesting to see how they've shifted from resenting its political influence to trying to harness its political influence.
Yeah, it definitely is very interesting because I know that same parallel was applied to Canada, because I know Poilievre made a public statement saying, I have all of my MPs not being on TikTok, and we're looking to very closely follow what happens in the United States with it being banned.
And there are various restrictions for its presence on government devices, not that politicians should be conducting their partisan social media using a government device.
You'd be surprised, but yeah, there's no
TikTok. I wouldn't be that surprised. I mean, I've been a staffer, a campaign staffer. I've never had the privilege of working in an elected person's office because I guess I wasn't that good at getting people elected. But so yeah, it wouldn't shock me that they're doing it, but they definitely shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, there's a difference between should and do, so you never know.
You could forget a book. You could write a whole encyclopedia about everything politicians do that they shouldn't.
Ain't that right?
No, but back going on to more about yourself. Like you really did get your start by making memes and TikToks and compilations about the mayor of Vaughan, or as you call him, the Don of Vaughan, Stephen Del Duca. What really attracted you to him as like a figure of memes?
Not gonna lie, it was actually an idea from somebody else who initially gave me the idea. Shout out to Heather for giving me that idea. But it was initially like, I think it was the idea of this man who is entirely risless, incredibly boring, a guy who is incredibly unassuming, who is this like Riz King, who is like the most charismatic figure.
I assumed there was a sense of irony behind it, but it is interesting to know that was the authorial intent.
Absolutely. And I think that everybody far and wide should know the infinite Riz that this man beholds.
Yeah, it's like, I think what really just told me we were going to lose the 2022 election horribly was when he got mad at Doug's cheesecake video and made his own cheesecake video saying, "Oh, but you know that Doug Ford's ruining your life." And I'm like, I'm sorry, but like when you're going after a guy who's like, "I made a cheesecake, isn't it nice?" Like, you seem kind of like a psychopath.
Yeah, that video was not very well made. You need to measure. You need to measure what's important. I think what he said in that video. I don't know who told him to say that, but that was not very politically astute.
But was it more or less politically astute than when they made the little video clip of someone in a chicken costume going around the PC candidates' offices?
I would say it really depends, but speaking on seeing that cheesecake video, it like I have shivers down my spine still thinking about that. That was
Oy.
just the most tone deaf you can be.
And for context, the reason that they were calling conservative candidates chicken, air quotes, in 2022 was that conservative candidates were not showing up to debates and ridings for candidates. And if anything, this became even worse in 2025 with Doug Ford openly admitting to journalists that he was telling his candidates to not go to debates. But it is interesting that he not only was he not punished for that, it kind of just feels like a confirmation that people do not care whether a politician holds themselves accountable, whether to the press or through the media or to the public, and there is a certain team sports aspect to it.
Yeah, for sure. Like I think if you look provincially in terms of how we've seen these elections come out, you can say everything you want and try and hold them as accountable, but speaking to people in real life who like Doug Ford, it seems like there's this shift of it being more so vibes based than actually policy based, as bizarre as it is to say. Like I work a normal 9 to 5 job. So speaking to Doug Ford fans just in my day to day, like it seems like they like him because they judge him as somebody that they can share a beer with, not so much that he's somebody who's like advocating for cutting taxes or the traditional sort of conservative talking points of the average pundit. It like the vibes-based sort of politics, I think, is a big part of the success or failure of these elections that have been going through.
And that kind of indicates in a fashion that when people say, "Oh, the liberals need to move to the left or to the right or to the center," or whatever prior that person is trying to confirm so they can use their bias to inform their direction, like, doesn't it imply that actually what's more important is just being a likable person, and then people may kind of just follow you anywhere you're willing to lead them?
That's exactly it. Like the big thing that I had noticed was like Bonnie Crombie as a liberal leader, really not the most likable, seems a little bit disconnected, maybe a bit on like an ivory tower. Like if you've seen her house in Mississauga, like very, very bougie, very like average person wouldn't exactly relate to this kind of
I
person. Whereas
assume,
Doug Ford,
to be frank, that anybody who owns a home in the GTA lives in an ivory tower.
You're definitely right on that one.
With current
but
housing and rental prices, I think I think being landed gentry is pretty much the main definition for whether you're rich or poor now in Canada.
yeah, well, Doug Ford's bourgeoisie, but he pretends to be one of the working proles, and it's been working the past three elections. So, got to figure out what his secret sauce is.
True, and in a way, his social conservatism does seem to be at least a little appealing to private sector unions and labor in a way that the NDP isn't really prepared to respond to, because in some cases, the union members are voting against their own economic interests because they agree with his social direction and his vibes against being politically correct or woke or whatever the new pejorative for caring about other people is.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think it also goes from a comms perspective of how the NDP is sort of tailoring its own election cycles as well. Because you start to see the NDP gearing more towards like the younger, more educated, urban Gen Z youth versus the more like what you would see the primary demographics of like your Hamiltons and whatnot that have traditionally voted NDP of being more like older, blue collar union guys and gals that have been there for a while.
And they are
So
able to hold down their traditional strongholds still to an extent, but they are having significant trouble expanding beyond it.
yeah, like they've been trying, but it's just you
Well,
know,
for a given definition of trying,
yeah.
they're trying my patience.
Man, they're trying everybody's patience. Those stupid TikToks, man.
Yeah, and I mean, like on that note, like, do you find yourself? Are you a liberal member, or do you? Where do you find yourself on the political spectrum?
Liberal, federally, and provincially.
Ah, okay. Registered or just supportive?
Registered, good sir.
Ooh, fun times. I am also a registered federal and provincial liberal. For those listening at home who haven't managed to figure out yet that I do put it in the opening blurb of my website, but sometimes people are still confused when they're like, wait, you're a member of a political party? And I'm like, yes. Yes, I am.
Yeah. I think people should put two and two together that I'm liberal if I'm, LARPing as a former liberal leader.
You would think that, but that is the dance you do with irony, like, because you are semi-ironically posting, but you're still posting from a liberal perspective. How much difficulty do you have making sure the irony comes in at the right level and that people understand the intended tone of your content?
People don't, and I don't care.
Valid. Honestly, that's about the best answer you can give, because it really is Poe's law, isn't it? You don't know whether someone's being ironically silly or is genuinely silly. So, do you find it freeing to just not care and make the content that speaks to you?
Oh yeah, like people will all the time be like, "Is this serious? Is this not?" And I think that's kind of partially, like, that's sort of partially the humor in it as well, and that's sort of where Gen Z humor comes in. Is not only is it ironic, but it's also the irony comes in people taking it way too seriously as well. Like the amount of TikTok comments that I get of people who, like, I got somebody who sent me a DM on TikTok recently that was like, "What in the hell is this?" and then blocked me, and I'm like, "Buddy, you're the intended audience a part of this because I get to laugh at you as much as as much as these other people get to laugh at the memes too." So I think it's great, and I think it sort of adds to the humor of all these people thinking Stephen Del Duca is this Riz King and puzzle master so seriously.
But to push a little, you do in many ways create vibes through the content that you post. So do you feel any sort of responsibility towards the way that people interpret your content and how it mobilizes them to act politically?
I do now have to be a little bit more careful in that back in when I started in about 2022, I had to be a lot more, like I was a lot more sort of unhinged when it came to my content, and I could just be like, yeah, screw it, I'm just going to post this random like Stephen Del Duca video. But now I think as I've grown more of an audience, and I think now as I have like actual staffers, actual comms people representing like politicians following me now, I think I kind of have to be a little bit more careful because I know that some of Poilievre's people are also following me on Twitter. So I'm like, okay, I kind of have a little bit more of a responsibility to.
Oh, I've got a Scamsky from Polyev's office, one of his media people following me too. So I get the feeling when suddenly you've got the opposition following you, and then all of a sudden your random tweets of yours are getting bookmarked, and it's like, I hope it's good fodder for the opposition research binder.
Yeah, have fun with that one, Mr. D. Coms at Polyev, saying,
Yeah.
Stephen Del Duca's wrist. Like, great. What are you going to do with that? Not much.
What's funny is then, like, after he followed me, I just started tagging him in things, and then he wouldn't respond. And I'm like, well, it cuts both ways. If I know you wanted me to know you're watching me, so now I know you're watching me, and I'm going to have fun with that.
Yeah, and I think at the same time, it's sort of like, are they following me because they want to take notes of how I do my communications and they want to emulate it, or do they enjoy the content and they take it with a grain of salt? Like, I think that's also intriguing, is like, why are you here when you know I'm pretending to be a liberal politician and I posted about the liberal election results? What are you doing here, buddy?
And in a way, they play with disguising intent the same way you do, to an extent. You're able to play with irony as a tool of humor, and in a similar fashion, they're able to play with what terms they engage with you on as a tool for their own amusement as well.
It's a fun cat and mouse game.
Indeed. I think that's why people are very hit and miss with me, because I kind of just cut through the Gordian knot, and and they don't appreciate someone pulling back the curtain and revealing the man controlling the giant robot wizard head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But on a final note, I guess, before we take our break and then launch to our headline topics, I think something that interested me the most is your banner picture on your Twitter account, where you talk about the jester's privilege, as I mentioned in the opening. Could you explain a bit more about that first?
Yeah, sure. So that was a replacement from the previous banner that was the Ontario Liberal Party saying "Liberal I Heart Del Duca." I thought that one was a little genius bit of Photoshop, but
you found the font for the new Bonnie Crombie era Liberal logo, so you put in the Del Duca thing, which I thought was personally inspired. But then you moved on to the jester's privilege one.
Yeah, because basically it was a twofold situation. So one was Twitter is now, or X, I don't know if you want to call it that. I think this is the only appropriate time dead naming is fine, where you call Twitter, or you call X Twitter, but
I'll call it by its new name when Elon accepts that his daughter is his daughter and calls her by the name she wants to be called by.
There you go. So basically, Twitter started cracking down on a policy where you have to flag yourself as a parody account or you could risk suspension. So after I put that on, somebody responded to me and was like, the Don of Vaughan now has jester's privilege, and I was like, that's kind of genius. So I put that on as a one-fold, and twofold, my profile picture is of Vermeer's The Girl with the Pearl Earrings with Stephen Del Duca photoshopped onto it. So I think that's pretty obviously a satire account picture.
True. Although I think, like, in a way, the jester's privilege thing does apply to you very accurately. You are, in essence, the court jester. You're able to mock Del Duca in a way that is amusing and that he might not be so fond of if other people were to do it.
Exactly, and I can mock openly Polyev, and his comms team still follows me. So I will take advantage of the jester's privilege as much as I so please.
Well, I hope a bit of that jester's privilege can rub off on me, because God knows I get blowback sometimes for my content.
Start taking notes of my comms content, buddy.
Oh, I'm taking notes. I wish I was good as a video editing as you are. But yeah, that will do it for our first half. But don't go anywhere, folks, because soon we will be coming back after the break with our 3 headline topics of the week. And boy, are they interesting. See you soon. Today's episode of It's Getting Pretty Late with Jake Landau is brought to you by me. Yes, today we are asking you to please subscribe to our Substack at jakelandau.ca/subscribe. All of our content is available for free without a paywall. However, in order to fund the creation of this podcast, original journalism, and other Jake Landau endeavors, we do in fact need money, especially because I like eating food, and if I don't eat food, I'll die. So, any support you can provide is deeply appreciated. Thank you, and enjoy the show. And we are back from the break with our guest, the anonymous Don of Vaughan. We have 3 new headline topics for you. Same recipe as always, folks. 2 big ones and then one that slips a little under the radar. And to start things off with the fever sweep in the entire nation, let's go on about the Liberal leadership contest that will decide the next Prime Minister of our country. Will that be only for a couple short weeks, or will they end up winning an election to lead for maybe another majority mandate? We don't know. It could be anything in between. But from our guest here, what do you think about the meme game going on in this contest? Because I know you've made a bit of TikToks now about Mark Carney.
Yeah, so I don't know how I managed to do it. I don't know if it's I had a prophetic vision or what, but I sort of jumped on the Carney bandwagon back in like September, making a couple of memes here and there, and now all of a sudden he's the front runner in the Liberal election. So it's a very interesting thing to see.
To be fair, I think there was a general perception that the reason he wasn't accepting Trudeau's offer to join cabinet is because he wanted to have his own cabinet. And I think that was it's a little more obvious in hindsight, but you certainly did get in at the ground floor in September.
Yeah, for sure. So I think like right now I haven't been seeing too terribly many memes about it, but I have been seeing, in terms of the sheer amount of momentum between the 4 major candidates right now, Carney has been by and far the most successful on TikTok, even without them making a single post on TikTok.
Interesting. So that's certainly an interesting flex, like that they're able to have that sort of media play without even trying.
Oh yeah, like the first post I made about Mark Carney, it got about 250,000 views.
Do you think
the demographics is insane?
Do you think that Mark Carney, Carmageddon, or Mark Mentum, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, do you think that had an upward lift on the Liberal popular vote in the last provincial election here in Ontario a few days ago?
Sort of, not necessarily. Like, I think that there was maybe a little bit of an upswing just because I think that there might have been some fatigue with Doug Ford or whatever it so may be. But I think for the most part, like the federal and the provincial Liberals are pretty well segregated from each other in terms of how they independently perform. So,
and it didn't used to always be this way, but I got involved right about when the segregation started to happen in full effect. And I think 2022, when the federal government told staffers they weren't allowed to go help on the provincial election, was pretty much the death knell.
Yeah, for sure. Like a lot of talent that could have been transmuted between one or the other just kind of got a little bit limited. So it is what it is.
Interesting. And how much of your Carney content is ironic compared to your Del Duca content? Is it the same tinge of irony?
I would say it's a little bit more serious. I would say Del Duca content is about 92% ironic. I do think he is...
Very specific number effective. You got there.
Yeah, like there's a tinge of, I think he actually has been a pretty okay mayor of Vaughan, and I think he was made for municipal politics. I think provincial might have been a little bit too exciting for him. But I think the Mark Carney stuff that I'm posting right now is there's a tinge of it being a little bit more serious because I think I absolutely don't want to see a Canada run by Poilievre. And I think that out of the 4 candidates that I've been seeing right now, personally, I think Carney seems to be the one that I'm probably going to lean towards putting one on the weighted ballot. So
you haven't voted yet in the on the ranked ballot for the leadership?
Too busy making memes, apparently.
Fair enough. I already have voted, and for those interested, I put out an article on my website at jakelandau.ca, which you can all go and visit, explaining how I ranked my ballot and why I put everybody in the place I did. But to put it shortly, I put Frank Bayless number 1, I put Karina Gould number 2, I put Mark Carney number 3, and I put Chrystia Freeland number 4. So if Carney would be your number 1, where would you rank the other 3 candidates?
I would say after I witnessed the debate, I watched the English one, the French one, I would need to brush up on my grade 12 to really get into. But
To be fair, they did translate it and broadcast the French debate in English on CBC.
yeah, they did. I caught the highlight of Nous sommes d'accord avec Hamas with Carney, so that was a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, that was certainly interesting. I feel bad for Mr. Bayless that he had interesting policy on Palestine, and all anybody could talk about was the fact that Carney doesn't know how to speak French.
Yeah, it's worth the shot. It's the trying that counts. I've heard some people in Quebec say as long as they're trying, it's fine. There's a little bit of forgiveness there.
True.
It was just a slip up.
Yeah, true. And I've backpacked up and down the St. Lawrence, so I know firsthand they really do. When you give it a sincere effort, then they have all the respect in the world for you. So, and I think more Anglos should make a sincere effort. But back to the main question, how would you rank Bayless, Chrystia Freeland, and Karina Gould, and Frank Bayless before from 2 to 4 on your ballot?
Yeah, for sure. So obviously Carney being 1 there. I would say number 2 would be Karina Gould. I was actually very impressed with how she had debated when the actual debate was going on during the English debate. She really knew how to present herself. She was very fluid. She was very congruent. She had some really good one-liners that she had in there. I think it was "Don't bring a calculator to a gunfight" was one of her quotes that she had there. So she's clearly very put together, very effective. I think maybe a 37-year-old running the country is a little crazy, but I definitely would be very interested and very close. I would very closely watch her momentum in the next 1 or 2 election cycles to see how she really does. I think given the times that we're in right now and the urgency of somebody to come in who knows the economy, knows how to deal with crises, I think we may need to put somebody who has a little more experience forward. But I definitely am very impressed with Gould. So for me, she goes in number 2 for me, because I think that I personally was an advocate for Nader Erskine-Smith when he ran for provincial, and I was very close with the team when they were their comms team when they were trying to go for the Liberal leadership back in late 2023, I best believe. And I see a lot of similarities between the two of them, these political mavericks that are coming in who look to try and reform things from the inside and do seem to have a chance of succeeding in that aspect. I think I do see that in Karina Gould the same way that I saw in him when I initially threw my support behind him as well. So right now, number 2, but I definitely would be very interested to see where she goes from there. So,
and I think your reasoning for why you put her number 2 is honestly pretty similar to the reasoning I put her number 2. I respect she was very, very competent in the debate. She has a clear, coherent ideological stance. Then she's making an explicit play for the progressive side of our party. I would rate her experience a bit higher than you would, just because of how much she's done in cabinet. But I understand to an extent that her economic chops may not be part of that experience. But on number 3 and number 4, I guess then, how are you ranking Bayless and Freeland?
I would say Bayless would be number 3. I think I don't really know that much about him personally. I've seen some stuff about him. I think he's, fairly well put together, but I think given between Gould and Carney, I think he slips a little bit more further down. Again, it's more just out of ignorance rather than anything else. I don't know too terribly much about him, but number 4 definitely goes to Freeland, just from personal anecdotes from staffers and from having to see how she's historically performed. I'm not really all that impressed with her. Between some very interesting things that she said in the past and the sort of underwhelming performance that she had at the actual debate itself, I personally wasn't too terribly impressed. And like, there's been a couple of things that she said in the past that doesn't really point to her being the most politically astute. One being vibe session, which, from what I've been told by staffers, was something that she was advised not to say and said anyways.
Oh, I love when politicians do things their staffers beg them not to do.
Yes.
Like Mark Miller, the Minister of Immigration, has a group chat where his staffers will say, "Mark, please don't tweet that," and then he tweets it anyways. And yes, I can confirm this is true. I am keeping my source on that one anonymous, but if anyone questions the truthfulness of that, I am happy to defend it in court.
Yeah, I don't know. I've heard the same. I've heard the very same thing as well. But I think it's kind of a power move. But Freeland,
Oh yeah, sometimes it does work. Sometimes staffers can get a bit lost in their own tunnel, to be fair. But other times they do actually know what they're talking about, and there's a reason you're paying them to work for you.
For sure.
Yeah, I think the final note on Freeland, I think, before we move on to our next topic, I think what really interested me, well, not interested, what kind of concerned me was just on Friday when she went on Bill Maher's show in the United States, and one of the things she talked about was that she wants to step away from identity politics and virtue signaling, and that really did concern me because these are kind of dog whistles that right-wingers use to say that they don't want to support gay people. And as a queer person, I would like to support queer people because I support me.
Yeah, like I think there was a better way of putting it, and I think her political instincts need to be a little bit more sharply tuned, given the fact that she lost a ton of MP support with her putting her own actions before the party, with resigning as finance minister, trying to propose the budget update. But yeah, like I get where maybe she was coming from initially in saying that she wants to shed away from identity politics. But when you're going in a party that is going against conservatism, where their entire MO is being anti-woke, it doesn't paint you in a very good light, because it does make it look like you're almost abandoning that idea of it, instead of just simply saying like, hey, let's be more pragmatic about it.
And that's part of what spoke to me about Frank Bayless. Since you missed the French debate, like there was his stance on Palestine, which is pretty clearly motivated by morals, on saying that if we support a two-state solution, we should recognize both states, which I think is pretty simple and an easy argument to make to the public. But also then he talked about Bill 96 in Quebec, and his opposition to how Muslim women were being discriminated against for wearing a hijab, and he compared it to the discrimination that his own mother faced as a person of color in Canada decades ago. So I was honestly, one of the reasons I put him at the top of the ballot, it wasn't anything as specific as Palestine, but it was more how he broadly fit into we're going to openly defend and fight for progressivism and social justice, rather than treat it as a bad word and something we need to hide.
And you know what? Valid.
Well, all right. Well, we will move on to our second topic of the day, which is about Alberta. Yes, there has been big fuss in Alberta recently over controversy in the Alberta Health Service over the awarding of health contracts and allegations of corruption. There has been a lawsuit from the former CEO of Alberta Health Services, who was let go in early January, alleging that high-level government officials interfered in bargaining to secure overpriced deals for private health contractors. Essentially, the allegation is that politicians and their staff interfered to some extent in the CEO of AHS in their duties to administer healthcare across the province, and as a result, contracts were awarded to people they maybe shouldn't have been awarded to for more money than the province should have paid. As a result, One member of Premier Danielle Smith's cabinet has resigned. Peter Guthrie has resigned as infrastructure minister after he called for an individual accused of involvement to step aside. However, Danielle Smith has resisted demands to call a full judge-led inquiry, and she has focused the blame on AHS and accused them of wanting to hoard the healthcare budget. Now, obviously, this is an incredibly interesting story, but I guess what I'll ask you as someone in the online sphere is, how much of this were you aware of this week before you knew it would be talked about today?
Next to zero.
And that's a pretty big problem for progressives, isn't it? That there's this notable story about whether there may be corruption in the Conservative government of Alberta, and it isn't really getting advertised to the masses.
Yeah, for sure. Like all of the story that I read about this AHS and the private contracting gives me PTSD from hearing about Doug Ford, Therm Spa, Ontario Science Center. It's all the same issues that are just revamped and repackaged into Danielle Smith instead of Doug Ford. But it's one of those things that is hard to really eloquently put to the public because there's a lot of moving parts that are involved in it. Like whenever you're dealing with any kind of financial controversies, there's always going to be layers upon layers of nuance and complications and
of course,
things like that
but
are hard to...
ultimately, isn't the job of a political communications staffer to make these complex problems easy to understand for the public?
1,000%. So I think that's sort of where, when I come in and see like these people report it and look at like, more nuanced financial cases, like summarize it, keep it simple, like what's going on here, why should we care, I think is a big thing when I see these kinds of issues.
I know that the NDP in Alberta, they were unable to win a government, and because it really is just the Conservatives and the NDP in Alberta who win seats, really. There's no such thing as a minority government, really, anymore. It's either just you win government and have a majority of seats, or you don't, because it's a two-party system now, in effect. And the NDP they were able to run up the score a lot in Edmonton, their traditional stronghold, and break through to an extent in Calgary. But in the surrounding areas, the parts that aren't those two big cities, like they were really unable to get through. Like, do you think that Naheed Nenshi, as the new leader of the Alberta NDP, will be able to push through that problem?
Not in this current political climate, maybe someday in the future, but given how inflammatory the current rhetoric is right now of being these crusaders against wokeness right now, it's going to be difficult to push through because having, met and dealt with people who not only work in like Calgary and Edmonton, but the more rural areas like Leduc, Fort Mac, all that, it's like a very conservative stronghold when you're dealing with a lot of Alberta's politics and especially their communications and their strategies. I think if you really want to appeal to them from an NDP perspective, it's going to be maybe geared a little bit more big tent, maybe geared a little bit more towards like keeping it simpler of why they should care. Because I think maybe there is a strategy where you can overcome a lot of this idea of like old school conservatives, like small government, things like that. It's more, if you want to call it libertarian sort of idea in Alberta of smaller governments.
People whose main focus is saying they want responsible fiscal and economic management, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you got it. So,
yeah. But in that case, isn't it frustrating that across the entire country, from coast to coast to coast, there seems to be a repeating dynamic that conservative right-wing forces are reputed for their economic chops, while notably making massive financial missteps like this, while the left-wing forces, which are forced by public scrutiny to manage things much more tightly, are then criticized for apparently being too loose with funds.
There is a term that you can cut through with why this is happening, and it's because people want lower taxes. Like the fiscal conservatism is just another name for lower taxes, which, we know who that benefits specifically. So
Yeah,
if
but
you cut
like
through that, you hear it.
you could have a society with zero taxes, and you would also have a Mad Max wasteland where you're like roaming around, like killing for sport. Like people kind of, I feel like the pursuit of lower taxes at all costs might be the end stage of many civilizations because we pay taxes because they do things that we think are necessary for the upkeep of society. Like, and how do you think that progressives are able to make the argument in the social media environment for why, yes, society is good and we should participate in society?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think if the opposition is saying we need lower taxes because we think, Canada, Ontario, Alberta, et cetera, has failed, then you can make the argument in saying that, okay, taxes are used towards XYZ and it's of a big benefit and we can help to do that. I think in the current climate that we have right now, it might be a little bit difficult just because we are in very difficult times, especially with COVID, with coming out of high inflation and now coming into a completely unnecessary trade war with the United States. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to paint that. But if we do paint the light of how we can help each other out through these programs, through everything like that, yeah, there might be a case to be made in that situation.
True, and I get your points about how it may be hard in the current climate, but ultimately, it was conservatives who created the current media climate by pushing relentlessly against the previous media climate a decade ago.
Yeah, it's an ebb and flow cycle that we're finding in. So we'll see if things bounce back.
Do you think that the vibes-based messaging that politicians are able to use could successfully accelerate that ebb and flow back to our side of the pendulum?
I think so. Like I've been seeing some TikToks recently, actually, of Bernie Sanders, who's been making a lot of really, really good, really smart, succinct messaging about what he's doing, and not to go back to, I think when I was talking about Karina Gold, Nate Erskine-Smith, he also has a TikTok page that's very like succinct, very like, here's what we're gonna do, here's how we're gonna help out, like that kind of like very punchy, succinct, but very packed full of information messaging, where it not only educates people but helps to give them an idea of, hey, I have a vision, I know where we can go, let's go. Like I think that can help to bring things around again. It's just a matter of how do you package it and how you think the opposition's going to interpret that.
Interesting. I mean, hopefully we'll actually start to at least attempt to try, because right now it feels like we've just thrown our hands up and said, why bother?
Yeah, it's not going to be easy, but I think there's a way out in this situation.
Alrighty. Well, moving on to our final topic of the day, we have news from the Atlantic. And the Atlantic, not the Maritimes, because Newfoundland and Labrador is also included in this story, and a lot of people who are not from the Atlantic mix those up frequently, and I say shame on all of you. But going into the story, from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador this week, Andrew Furey, the Liberal Premier, has announced that he will be stepping down and resigning as soon as the Liberals choose a new leader. And this is notable because only a few short days previously, Dennis King, the Conservative Premier of Prince Edward Island, made a similar pronouncement, resigning immediately and leaving an interim leader to be Premier until his Conservatives can pick a new leader to take over the role. And I think this is interesting because obviously, a premier resigning in Newfoundland and Labrador is not a new thing. In fact, to my knowledge, every elected premier has resigned before leaving office, and it's the ones who replace them in leadership contests who end up losing in Newfoundland after. So there's some interesting dynamics, and folks, feel free to dig into that some more, because I'm sure I got a detail wrong there. But I guess what I'd ask you, Mr. Don of Vaughan, is why do you think they're all jumping ship? Because it's one thing for one premier in the Atlantic to do it, but two in the same week is kind of concerning.
Tariffs.
Tariffs? Yeah.
Tariffs.
And it's funny because in their announcements they talked about leading the province through crises and Trump's threat to impose tariffs. So doesn't it feel like they're kind of not leading through this crisis? Like they're jumping off ship before the crisis and are like, good luck, goodbye.
Yeah, it seems a little bit of a strange move, but I think if you really dig down into why these premiers are so worried, you kind of have to look into how much of an economic dependence do these provinces have on the United States. Like the PEI, their premier resigned, but if you look at the actual breakdown of how much dependence they have on the United States, like potatoes is a big part of the PEI economy, not to stereotype too much. So having your exports be limited for potatoes is it's a very low margin product. So if you get hit by a tariff or anything like that and you need to replace your producer with somebody else, it's it's going to make your life a lot more difficult.
True, and I don't think you're stereotyping. I know PEI and also New Brunswick, to an extent, are large potato exporters, and you're correct that it is a very price-sensitive product. I know I can go to Longo's or Metro here in Toronto, and I can get a 10 kilogram bag of potatoes for $4 pre-tax, which is really not a lot when you consider all the effort that goes into actually growing all of those potatoes.
Yeah, for sure, because it's sort of a two-front thing of not only is your chief export going to be susceptible to U.S. tariffs, and also if they do decide to go with interprovincial trade as part of their big advocacy for being pro-Canada, how much do you actually benefit from those barriers being removed, or is it basically going to be status quo antebellum, where you're basically just the exact same as before because there
or
really
even
wasn't much
potentially worse
restriction.
than status quo, because now New Brunswick and PEI would be competing against each other in the potato market to many extents.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just a really matter of how much sensitivity does your economy have to it and that. So I think really just they didn't want the smoke and just decided, hey, best of luck to whoever's next. It's not going to be fun.
I do respect the ability for people to tell when the going is about to stop being good and when they know how to go out on a high note. It's just unfortunate when they kind of leave, several provinces worth of citizens in the lurch.
Yeah, it doesn't make you look good personally, but if you know how to go out with dignity, sure. But it does really seem like, we have a provincial election we have a leadership election that's coming up. And then, like, what's going to happen if, let's say, Carney gets elected as leader and then he decides to call an election in a month? We're going to have two elections in the span of 1 month? That's insane.
Yeah, and I mean, we already did just have the Ontario provincial election, and when people talked about how that would overlap with the federal one, I mean, we saw very well there where all the talent went to the federal level, and the Ontario Liberals kind of went bleh, and then it now third straight Ford majority, 1,000-year Ford Reich, like.
Yeah. It's just
I
crazy.
have never felt fear like I did when Doug Ford said he wants to be premier forever, like Hazel McCallion, and I'm like,
Oh, God.
oh no.
Yeah. Captain Canada over here wanting to be the Speaker of the House for Anti-Tariff Commission for Canada.
True. Yeah. Ultimately, I do think that it's interesting that in PEI, the one who was picked as the interim party leader, Rob Lance, who's now technically premier, even though they're only interim party leader because the party he's interim leader of is the government. But Rob Lance has said he has no intention of running as the permanent leader, despite the fact at one point he was the permanent leader of the party about a decade ago. So it is kind of interesting that even he doesn't want the job permanently.
Yeah, I think anybody can see that the going's going to get very, very tough.
True, but like it is kind of wild to be like, yeah, I don't want to be premier that long.
Yeah, it's polar opposite of being an Ontarian.
Yeah. Well, I think that does it for this week's show. Mr. Don of Vaughan, Mr. Anonymous, thank you so much for all of your commentary this week, and I look forward to seeing more of your memes.
I will be making more and more over time, and God willing, we'll see what happens in the near future.
All right. God bless. And that's the end of this week's program. Thank you to our anonymous guest, whose name we don't know, for tuning in to share his thoughts. But if you want to make sure you catch next week's guest, whose won't be anonymous and whose name we will know, then make sure to subscribe to this program at jakelandau.ca/podcast or in your favorite podcast app. Thank you, and cheers.